Does that work? Oh God, yeah, that works. Yeah, it really, really works. Okay, thanks for inviting me. I'll try to be quick. It already feels like we've been here a long, long time. Okay, social reproduction and racial capitalism. So I couldn't tell where to start, because you can't really tell who you'll be speaking to. And I kind of have perhaps unfair hunch from looking at the audience that a lot of you don't really work around issues of race and perhaps don't even read that literature that much. I might be completely mistaken, but so maybe stop me at some point. So I thought I would say that in my view, most people who work around issues of race and racism don't think that race is a material referent that you can read up from, really following on from the point that was made in the audience in the last Q&A, that there's no preceding biology that is then organised in the world. Race is constructed through the process of different kinds of power attribution. So that, just start from that, because I've had a few very odd experiences where I start talking and then clearly we just whoosh past each other. So, don't believe that race exists, but I do believe that race has real social implications and outcomes. It doesn't have a pre-social existence, but it comes to life as we go through this ugly world that we're all living in. So within that framing of what I think race is, that there's a whole set of debates about what racial capitalism can be, but I think nearly all of them, even though they don't agree on every point, all are trying to think about the ways in which capitalism inhabits and leverages racialised divisions for cumulative ends. So there's something about how you can inhabit people's antagonisms, how you can make them different, that makes accumulation happen better for you. Not for you, the racialised person, but the whole system works better. And within that set of processes, even though we might not agree absolutely how they happen, there's a whole set of only half-spoken questions about what the role of social reproduction was. And we had a quick word in the lunch hour that there's almost no conversation between these arenas of thought. If there is, I've not hardly found it, so please tell me where it is. Both arenas are interested in the other one, but there is very little sustained engagement. So there's people who kind of work around social reproduction stuff here, who know that race is part of it, but kind of wave over. There's people over here who are interested about race and capitalism, know that social reproduction, but so there's a kind of bridge to be made. I'm not really the person to make all of that bridge, but I'm saying to you, I think some of us together should make that bridge. As I've already said, that when people talk about racial capitalism, they're really talking about the sets of processes through which capitalist formations differentiate populations. That already came up in the first session. And in particular, how that differential status becomes associated with a kind of racialised naming. So not only do you have differential status, but that becomes naturalised, racialised, adhered to your body in some way, has all those mythologies of race kind of squashed onto it. And often you can see that there's a kind of toing and froing between these things. So the differentiation of populations can often take the form of quite straightforward labour market segmentation. I think you've already talked about that in the course of the day as well. So often takes the form of things like depreciated wages, which are kind of informally enforced through both popular prejudice and perhaps state inaction, and sometimes systems of active making unequal of segregation. Barriers to entering or remaining in the labour market, actually lots of that is informal. Lots of that's happening in Britain, isn't it? You know, you don't need to have a formal system of segregation to make sure that some people find it very hard to enter work or stay in work. And those kinds of combinations of forcibly depreciated wages and additional barriers to entering or remaining in the labour market mean that for those groups who become kind of stamped with this lesser racialised status, there's a greater dependence on practices of social reproduction and a more precarious engagement with the market. Some of that's historical. Some of that we know has happened for different migrant and minoritised communities. Certainly a lot of the American literature talking about the ways in which different communities are forcibly brought to the States shows how there's a different engagement with the formal economy. If you're an African American, you live under segregation in which your access to the labour market is as narrow as this. The realm of social reproduction is this whole community endeavour. I think there's lots of that going on in this country as well. I think what was the figures? I've forgotten. Just after the crash, 2008 crash, I'm pretty certain, although I didn't remember to read it before I came, that Britain was counting more than 50% of young black people out of work. And that was actually only up from about 30% in boom time. So like even in boom time, for some communities, the labour market is kind of, it's here, but it doesn't fulfil what the whole economic needs of your community are. In similar ways, this comes and goes, but as we're in Mile End, there's been an ongoing policy concern in this country, depending on whether we're concerned or not, about whether or not Bangladeshi and Pakistani women are economically active. Very, very high levels of economic inactivity, again, echoing what we were all kind of talking to each other about in the morning. What counts as economic activity? Of course, the kinds of things that a lot of those women are doing, even when it's paid work, does not become visible in this counting of the formal economy. But it also means that it reflects a whole particular racialised economic positioning, which means necessarily those households and those communities have to organise the business of life slightly differently from those communities who have a relatively less encumbered entry into the labour market. So you get that. So that's kind of one of the big things that people interested in racial capitalism might be interested in. This is a memory to myself. And more, I keep changing my mind, but today I still think that it's quite useful to think of racial capitalism as in different ways being a way of a set of techniques to extract value from the sphere of social reproduction. So certainly some things people have already talked about, that the ways in which you extract value from those not engaged in formal wage work, and a lot of the global stuff that you've already talked about today. But in some ways, of more interest to me is the stuff that happens in the global north. That what happens when you've got people engaged in wage work that's paying too little to remake life? Again, half of London lives like that, and the half of London lives like that looks more like me than a lot of you. Don't want to be rude about this, but you can see, you only have to step out in the city to see how that is happening. Alongside that, the informal economy, the post-colonial wasteland, all the ways in which people are kind of doing things for money or in kind that doesn't pass through the formal economy. And something about the stuff that was very strong in the first session about what are the techniques that allow the business of life to somehow be further stripped of resources, especially for those communities who always had a precarious relationship to the so-called formal economy. That, anecdotally, and even more reading other people's stuff, we all know that's kind of happening. What do we do with that knowledge? Right. This maybe should have been earlier. This is still the story of what should you understand by racial capitalism. A lot of this I am talking about the global north because that's the history of racism that I know more. I think it probably does transfer to some other places, but I'm kind of talking about Britain, Europe, North America. The production-reproduction nexus has been deployed as a racialising marker, that idea of how particular groups of people slot together their productive and reproductive actions to make themselves. And you'll hear what I mean a bit more when I say some of the things it can mean. So a combination of characterising access to and proficiency in formal work. So if you've lived in Britain a while, you can see that's so intensively racialised, both through the business of employment and through the business of the state. That what it is to be work ready, that's already got this long racial tail. Alongside the manner of organising and disciplining the domestic sphere and the performance and management of gender and sexuality. What I mean by that is some households are bad households because they're not so easily work ready, or what they mean by becoming work ready is not what the policy says it should be. Some of that is about who parents, too much fathering, too little fathering, overbearing mothering, absent mothering, shift work mothering, all these things. They're in the places I know best, these are become highly racialised markers that what is wrong with your household in relation to the combination of production and reproduction is a way of slotting you into a certain kind of racialised hierarchy. And so degrees of distance from the ideal type become intertwined with accounts of racialised difference. Racialised difference calls up all this other huge mythology, but it's got that as a repertoire to say, aha, lazy natives, I'll show you a lazy native in Stepney Green. So it kind of pulls the historical reference point to tell the story of race in the place you are now. It's already discernible in colonial accounts. If you've ever read, again, because I'm based in Britain, Britain wrote volumes and volumes of blue books when it went around owning the world. And lots of that, it's like bizarre social science. It's like these blokes sitting around saying, and I watch the people and let me tell you this is what they do. A lot of what they say in those blue books are observations around ideas of production, reproduction, the link between them, how people arrange their family life, how they arrange their leisure, why they're too leisurely, all of those. So it's in the colonial administration, and it's also in the flashbangs of colonial culture. So it's in the entertainment of the paintings, in those lovely the stuff that Said talks about, why is it that Europe for a while is obsessed with looking at paintings and thinking, the harem. That means that you think those people, they cannot organise either their productive or reproductive sphere to make stuff. If you give them a chance, they'll just loll about in the bath all day, waiting to have another shag. That's what they're like. That's why they can't be productive citizens. That's why we need to come and own them. So you've got that history, and it impacts on how people get racialised status now. Because it's also painfully apparent in ongoing modes of state racism. The ways in which some people's home lives are criminalised, so all of the ways in which black families have been criminalised for as long as there have been black families in this country, but also other ways in which Muslim families start to be criminalised. So it's not a right way of doing things. It's not that there's happy mummy and daddy, Janet and John. It's that there are different ways of being familial, and the different ways of being familial become part of what makes you in the eye of the state storm. And those techniques of racialised scrutiny and intrusion are so embedded in the ways in which the British state in particular, but I think that machinery is spreading out in different ways across Europe, and in some ways was marketed first of all in the United States. It's all intertwined with how people are positioned to have access to benefits, education and the labour market. So it makes you a certain kind of economic subject. Your access to the criminal justice system, the way in which your familial organisation is racialised and scrutinised and demonised, that then becomes like the ticket you take to what is left of the social wage. So even in as much, like, we've not even got on to whether there's a social wage left anymore, but in as much as there are some social goods left, your access to them are filtered through these things. So this bit I didn't need to say as much because I forgot that this is what all of you do. Normally I have to explain this stuff to people who think about race but don't think about social reproduction. Oh, hurry up with this. Okay. We've already talked about, like other people have talked in much more detail and in far more fluency than me about the ways in which we have been witnessing a whole array of techniques through which value is scraped out of the sphere of social reproduction, including for those who are excluded or marginalised from mainstream labour markets. As far as I could hear in the morning, we were very much talking about spaces in which the expulsion from the formal labour market is relatively recent, or the entry into the formal labour market is relatively recent. One of the things about racial capitalism as a set of theories, and it's a set because people haven't agreed yet, is to think that there's something about keeping some populations in a precarious relation to the labour market at all times, boom and bust, that needs to be heard as a kind of racialising discipline. For those people, So even if it's boom time and only 30% of your young people are unemployed and will always be unemployed, there's still going to be something about the social reproduction of your community which gives some value to the mainstream. Or as my father said when I used to live in Birmingham for a very, very, very long time. I still find it very difficult to navigate London. And the part of Birmingham I lived in, Lascelles, Birmingham is an absolutely segregated city. Londoners don't understand that if you go outside London, people of different, different ethnicities don't see each other that much. Most of Britain outside of London imagines itself as a white nation in which there are some kind of strange newcomers who you see in the corner shop if you go to the restaurant neighbourhood. Birmingham, despite being the second greatest density of people, of black and brown people after London, has those communities live only in 6 segments of the city. So most of Birmingham is kind of a white city with these 6 segments of black and brownness. So I lived in one of those. And when the crash happens, my dad's trained as an economist, so he reads this stuff, and he comes and says, "Oh, that's strange. Lascelles, there's this table of indices of resilience in the face of economic crisis." He says, "This is strange. Lascelles seems to be topping the table of the most resilient neighbourhoods probably in England, like nearly in England. So, how is that? Seems a bit strange." Come on, you know the punchline. Of course, the punchline is fewer people with jobs to lose in Lascelles, and so it seems like you're more resilient, because the shift between economic boom and economic crisis is a smaller shift for Lascelles than it is for all the places where people have the benefits of boom time. That's just a way of pinning in your head, okay, but something else is happening in Lascelles then, in terms of how people are living and what good that way of living is to a productive economy. Right. Okay, I've already said that in part, I think, about norms of domesticity. I do also think, I was going to say something else I forgot when someone else was speaking earlier, I must remember to say this. But there's also something about the ways in which they're being pushed into ongoing precarity and or poverty for some communities as a racialised experience inhabits different ways of living. And I was thinking that there's lots of horrible stuff about the female-centred household amongst African Caribbean populations. There's less written, but I think there ought to be more thought given to the ways in which South Asian populations in this country have, partly through culture, whatever that may be, part more likely through lack of other options, have lived in different kinds of communal models. Firstly, things like the extended family anyway. Of course, that has a cultural reference point, but it has a different kind of cultural reference point when you can't access banking and you can't access labour. But there's also something about how cooperative living beyond the nuclear family might happen. Now, that has always been seen as a bad thing about the Asian community. And there's a thin line from saying there's a problem with that to saying that this is why Asian women don't work to saying this is why you're radicalisation soft point, that there's a kind of linking across those things. However, at the same time, I don't need to tell you, that those kinds of on-the-hoof remakings of something like a cultural reference point to just about survive in a new location allow social reproduction and a sharing of whatever gains from the formal economy they are in a different setting. Certainly lots, again, Birmingham. We talk about Birmingham all the time, but there's a whole load of, and I didn't know this because I'm not from Birmingham, I'm from Leicester, which is a slightly different Asian community. There's a whole load of Asian people in Birmingham who own their own houses, partly because they couldn't rent, because no one's going to rent one of us, but also couldn't get bank accounts, so that their houses, which are kind of owned in common across a range of family members, or the borrowing happens across a range of family members. I think those things are very common across different migrant communities, and I think in other European countries, different migrant communities use a different set of financial techniques for when you're excluded from the mainstream financial market, semi-excluded from the formal labour market, pretty much absolutely excluded from the rental market, then you do certain things. That seems to me that like it enables some kind of pulling out of value into the mainstream productive economy for those who go and enter it. because it's a whole load of people who are reproducing those who are workers. Sorry, I'm going to hurry up now. I'm nearly finished now. Right. These bits I'm not sure about the answers to, but I thought some of you would know more than me, and I'd write it down quickly. It seems likely to me that the social reproduction of spheres of affluence, either in the sections of the global north who've still got bits of affluence, the bits of London where people go for coffee rather than go out to do security work, and also the elite pockets in the global south benefit from the activity, work and non-work, of poor regions and segments. Like, all the day is really about that question, isn't it? But then what do we mean by that? How does it happen? And I think we need to stretch our understanding a little more, but I'm not yet there. Right, I'm not going to say that bit. Okay, all of that stuff you've said before, you've already said it, that we're not waiting for everyone to become a fully fledged wage worker and then enter the formal economy, which I have to say, even earlier in my life, was how development talk worked. Sooner or later, everyone is going to get to work, and then we're game on. Even the IMF's not saying that now, so you kind of think, oh, game off again. And it's fairly easy for us to understand some of the things we've talked about. You know, we know about reproduction through households. We know a bit more now than I think we did 30 or 40 years ago about reproduction through communities and the ways in which that might be tied to a location. And we're increasingly talking about the ways in which aspects of human social reproduction come to be folded into the category of nature, and through this quickly translated into being a natural resource. I'm talking about myself here. I'm finding it much less easy to think about how practices of social reproduction in arenas distant or excluded from the productive sphere remain sources of supplementarity for the most affluent sections of the world. I know it's been mentioned throughout here, but I'm not quite getting my slides in order. So if anyone knows or can tell me something to read, that'd be great. And instead, I mean, I'm an optimist. I always think we're going to win in the end. It's just when the final day of winning will be. It's a bit delayed endlessly. But again, people have said it. It does seem right now, as the planet collapses, that instead of a point of reunification, battles over survival include a kind of misuse of the terms of social apartheid. So we see that this week, at last, even the elite have come out with the phrase climate apartheid. That means who has access to the means of life and who doesn't, and who must not have access to the means of life, otherwise me and mine will not survive. I don't know how else to hear or read that. So even the rich have come to think beyond the productive economy and to include this concern about an access to the means of life, but within the narrative of their interests. That's in a time of climate crisis, that means I see social reproduction in its expanded form, in the broadest of resource bases, but I see it again as a battle about my interests, because we can't all have it. So I think then I'm still stuck with this question about, well, does the even further impoverishment of some benefit others? And Siggy already read out a bit that I've written before, that the further impoverishment of a lot of people is just death. Everyone dies. Half the people die before. Further impoverishment means genocide, out of the game. And in this time of climate crisis, I think some of how we speak to each other has to be thinking about how do we prevent a further erosion of access to the means of life for the many as the result of the already being made survival plans of the few. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that. Right, I'm done. Thanks very much.